Maynard Orme, who is the President and Chief Executive Officer of Oregon Public Broadcasting, who will introduce Professor Dyson.
Gravity. It always works. Thanks very much and welcome tonight to the initial ICEP lecture series. I'm personally very excited because I think that Freeman Dyson is one of the most highly evolved human beings I know, even though I just met him tonight. Why do I know this? Well, in the late 70s, the station I used to work at, KTH San Jose, produced a major and long-lasting, of importance, I think, documentary called Day After Trinity on the development of the atomic bomb. And Freeman Dyson was one of the featured interviews on that program, which was broadcast on OPB this summer, by the way, along with the Nagasaki program. I hope some of you saw that. Professor Dyson's fundamental contributions to science have been at the frontier of knowledge and have set, by their originality, rigor, and relevance, a high standard of excellence. He has helped popularize science through articles in Scientific American and The New Yorker, and many widely acclaimed books for the general public. In his writings, his courageous and informed challenges to conventional approaches to science and technology have been an inspiration to generations of scientists, and I might add, to general audience people like myself. Professor Dyson began his research as a mathematician before turning his interests in 1947 to the new developments in physics involving the theory of quantized fields. He's written papers on the foundations of quantum electrodynamics, which have been a profound and lasting influence on many branches of modern theoretical physics. Dyson has always been a writer. He has written excellent scientific reviews, and in the early 70s wrote on subjects that are still important today, such as controlling the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the benefits and dangers of recombinant DNA research. His books, for which he has received many literary awards, include his scientific autobiography, Disturbing the Universe, Weapons of Hope, Origins of Life, Infinite in All Directions, and From Eros to Gaia. Freeman Dyson was born in 1923 in Crowthorne, Berkshire, England, and earned his BA in mathematics at the University of Cambridge. His graduate studies were at Trinity College, Cambridge, and Cornell University in New York. He became an American citizen in 1957 and has received numerous international awards throughout his life. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, a fellow of the Royal Society, corresponding member of the Bavarian Academy of Sciences, honorary fellow of Trinity College, and many other memberships are on his vita. From 1953 to 1994, he was professor of physics at the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton, New Jersey, and currently he's a professor emeritus at the Institute's School of Natural Sciences. Would you please give a warm Portland welcome to Professor Freeman Dyson?
So I'm sorry I can't see your faces, but anyway, I hope later on when we have question and answer, they'll turn the lights down so I can actually see you. I apologize for reading from a text. When I talk about something I really know, I talk extemporaneously, but in this case, I think it's better to stick to the text. So the lecture consists of 4 parts. The first part about war and peace, the second about education, the third about science, and the fourth returning to war and peace. I chose Tolstoy and Napoleon as the protagonists of the story because they have important things to say and represent sharply different points of view in each of these areas. So I begin with war and peace. 50 years have gone by since the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We're 50 years distant from the great and terrible war that ended with those bombings, just as Lev Tolstoy was 50 years distant from the great and terrible war that he recorded in his novel War and Peace. We need now to find a historical perspective into which the bombings and the other catastrophic events of 50 years ago can fit. Tolstoy felt the same need. He struggled for 5 years to find some order in the chaos of the Napoleonic War. War and Peace is the record of his struggle as well as being a record of the war. He did in the end develop a coherent view of history. The human story that he tells in the novel is interrupted from time to time by the author expressing his personal view of the story's larger meaning. He describes the historic calamities of 1812, the death and destruction spread by Napoleon's armies as they moved into Russia, the dispersal and flight of the Russian population, the great battle at Borodino, and the burning of Moscow, all of them events unplanned and unforeseen. According to Tolstoy, the leaders were swept along by forces that they neither understood nor controlled. The nominal leaders on the two sides, Napoleon and Kutuzov, were never really in control. Since Kutuzov was aware of this and Napoleon was not, Kutuzov made fewer mistakes. But in the end, the outcome was determined by the individual actions of hundreds of thousands of ordinary soldiers whose decisions to fight bravely or to run away nobody could have predicted. Napoleon, says Tolstoy in his summing up of the lessons of history, Napoleon is represented to us as the leader in all this movement, just as the figurehead in the prow of a ship seems to the savage the force that guides the ship on its course. Napoleon, in his activity all this time, was like a child sitting in a carriage, pulling the straps within the carriage and fancying that he is moving it along. The recent battle fought over the Enola Gay exhibition at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum in Washington showed how far we are still from achieving a coherent view of the Second World War. The Smithsonian had planned to show the exhibition this summer to commemorate the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the end of the war. The public opposition to the Smithsonian's plans became so bitter that the exhibition was abandoned. My friend Martin Harwitt, the director of the museum who was responsible for the exhibit, was forced to resign. After the cancellation of the exhibit and the resignation of Harwitt, the debate continues. We are struggling, as Tolstoy struggled, to come to terms with a drama too large for any single mind to comprehend. The chief message of my talk today is that Tolstoy can help us in our struggle to understand. We have a lot to learn, and Tolstoy has a lot to teach. Tolstoy helped us to understand our predicament 50 years ago while the Second World War was raging around us, and not only in retrospect 50 years later. 50 years ago, Tolstoy and Napoleon were not remote historical figures, but ghosts sitting beside us every day at the breakfast table. I am, in a manner of speaking, only 3 handshakes away from Napoleon. When I was a child in England, my father used to talk about a memorable trip that he had made to Russia in the year 1912 when he was a young man. He was invited to Moscow by some musician friends, and he happened to be there for the centennial celebrations of the defeat of Napoleon in the campaign of 1812. He met a 105-year-old lady who played a prominent part in the celebrations. She remembered as a 5-year-old standing in the street and giving Napoleon an apple when he made his triumphal entry into the city. The celebrations were concerned not with Napoleon's triumphal entry into Moscow, but with his ignominious departure 5 weeks later and his disastrous retreat to the west. The story of the 1812 campaign was an important part of English folklore, well known to every English schoolchild. American schoolchildren miss hearing the story because their ancestors happened in 1812 to be fighting on the same side as Napoleon. My father told the story dramatically. He told how England had been engaged in an interminable war against Napoleon for 15 years. Napoleon had conquered the continent of Europe except for Russia, and England had little hope of defeating him. And then, suddenly and providentially, Napoleon was seized with madness, marched his grand army into Russia, and embarked on the sequence of tragic follies that destroyed the grand army and saved England. After I heard this story from my father, I read it in Thomas Hardy's drama, The Dynasts. I don't know whether anybody nowadays reads The Dynasts, but it made a deep impression on me. I remember especially the scene when dawn rises on a group of French soldiers huddled around a dead campfire on a snow-swept Russian steppe. The faces of the soldiers have been roasted by the fire, while their backs have been frozen by the wind. And then the Russian General Kutuzov comes riding by on his horse and says, "So perish Russia's enemies." A few years later, as a teenager, I read Tolstoy's more sophisticated version of the same story in War and Peace. So that story was fresh in my mind one June morning, the morning of June 22nd, 1941. I and a bunch of schoolboy friends came down to our study hall to listen to the BBC News on the radio. England was then fighting alone against Hitler, facing the same discouraging odds that we faced when fighting Napoleon 130 years earlier. Hitler had conquered the continent of Europe except for Russia, and it looked as if our war could go on for another 15 or 20 years if we were lucky enough to survive that long. And then the radio told us Hitler had marched his grand army into Russia. We went wild with joy. Suddenly, our future was transformed. Instead of a lifetime of war without end, we could look forward to another campaign of 1812. We could reasonably expect to see the end of Hitler within a few years. We could reasonably expect to survive Hitler and emerge into some kind of peace. But the news on the radio still seemed too good to be true. How could it have happened that Hitler caught Napoleon's madness? How could he not know that Russia would be his army's graveyard? Had Hitler never read War and Peace? Had none of the German generals read War and Peace? It was unbelievable to us schoolboys that those famous German generals knew less about the art of war than we did. And yet the events of that day made it clear that we had the advantage over the German generals. Evidently, they had not read Tolstoy, and we had. So echoes of those memories of 1941 could be heard this year in the debate over the Smithsonian exhibition. The debate was concerned with the question whether or not the nuclear bombing actually saved lives by bringing the war to a quick end. One of the issues under debate was the number of American soldiers who would have died in the planned invasions of Kyushu and Honshu if Japan had not surrendered in the summer of 1945. On the one side, President Truman and Secretary of War Stimson, in their personal accounts of those decisions for which they bore the primary responsibility, said the planned invasions of Japan could easily have resulted in 1 million American and several million Japanese deaths. On the other side, Martin Sherwin and other historians who have examined the recently declassified planning documents point out that the official military estimates of casualties in the planned invasions were far smaller. The planning documents calculate the number of American deaths to be less than 40,000 for both invasions together. I have examined the estimates of casualties in detail. The technical basis of these estimates was simple. The planners assumed a fixed casualty rate for each army involved in heavy fighting, 5% casualties per week, of which 1% would be killed. And those numbers were derived from the recent experience of earlier bloody campaigns in the Pacific Islands and in Okinawa. The planners then assumed that the invasions of Japan would involve 750,000 men and 6 weeks of heavy fighting. That was all. The estimates made sense if you believed that the conquest of Japan would be over in a few months. If you believed that the conquest of Japan was an undertaking of extreme hazard and unpredictable duration, the estimates made no sense at all. I have little doubt that Stimson and Truman were honest. Everything I know about them leads me to that conclusion. I also have little doubt that they were skeptical of any claim that the conquest of Japan could be completed in a few months. They had lived through the agonies of the Italian campaign of 1943 to 1945, when a small German army conducted a fighting retreat that lasted for 2 years and inflicted heavy casualties on the invading Allied forces. The geography of Japan is at least as rugged as the geography of Italy. The defending Japanese armies, unlike the Germans in Italy, would have had loyal support from a friendly population. I do not know how Stimson and Truman rated the chances of a successful conquest of Japan. I only know that if I'd been standing in their shoes, I would have been scared to death. I felt at the time, and I still feel today, that an invasion of Japan in 1945 might have been as total a disaster as Hitler's invasion of Russia 4 years earlier, or Napoleon's invasion in 1812. Just as Napoleon sat in the ruins of Moscow, waiting in vain for an offer of surrender from the Tsar, General MacArthur might have been sitting in the ashes of Tokyo, waiting in vain for an offer of surrender from the Emperor of Japan. Bitter fighting in the Japanese mountains might have continued for 20 years. The conquest of Japan might never have been finished. It was lucky for General MacArthur that the Emperor was staying in Tokyo to welcome him when he arrived. Both Stimson and Truman had a sense of history. They read many books. Probably they had read War and Peace. Even if they did not read Tolstoy, they had a Tolstoyan understanding of the chanciness of war and peace. They understood that military estimates of casualties at the beginning of an invasion of Japan were worth just as much as German estimates of casualties at the beginning of the invasion of Russia. Hitler, after all, expected the Russian campaign to be over in 6 months. No army beginning an invasion ever makes plans for a long war. And still, long wars happen. Long wars happen because it's easier to begin wars than to end them, as we learned later in Vietnam. Ending a war is what the Enola Gay exhibition was supposed to be about. The central question at the heart of the Enola Gay controversy is whether Japan would have surrendered if Hiroshima and Nagasaki had not been destroyed. Nobody will ever know the answer to that question. The best possible opportunity to discover the answer was given to Robert Butow, a historian who actually lives in Seattle, and he happened to be in Japan soon after World War II, when he was a young man, and wrote a book, Japan's Decision to Surrender, published in 1954. Butow had a unique opportunity to examine the official Japanese documents and to interrogate the responsible Japanese leaders while their memories of the concluding weeks of the war were still fresh. Butow asked each of the Japanese witnesses the same question, whether the surrender would have happened without the bombs. Butow's conclusion: the Japanese leaders themselves do not know the answer to that question, and neither do I. Tolstoy would certainly have agreed with Butow. Tolstoy himself fought with the Russian army defending Sevastopol against British and French invaders in the Crimean War. He saw war as a desperate muddle in which nothing goes according to plan, and the historical causes of victory and defeat remain incalculable. So here is Tolstoy's view of the nature of war, expressed in War and Peace through the voice of his hero, Prince Andrei. Andrei is talking to his friend Pierre on the eve of the Battle of Borodino. So here is Prince Andrei speaking. To my mind, what is before us tomorrow is this. 100,000 Russian and 100,000 French troops have met to fight, and the fact is that these 200,000 men will fight, and the side that fights most desperately and spares itself least will win. There's one thing I would do if I were in power. I wouldn't take prisoners. What sense is there in taking prisoners? That's chivalry. The French have destroyed my home. They are coming to destroy Moscow. They have outraged and are outraging me every second. They are my enemies. They are all criminals to my way of thinking. They must be put to death. War is not a polite recreation. War is the vilest thing in life. and we ought to understand that and not play at war. We ought to accept it sternly and solemnly as a fearful necessity. So that's the end of the quote. And I think without any great stretch of the imagination, one may hear these words of Prince Andrei as being spoken by a thoughtful Japanese soldier preparing to defend his country against the American invaders in the autumn of 1945. Well, that's enough about war and peace. I want to talk now for a few minutes about education. Napoleon and Tolstoy, besides both being soldiers, were also both educators. And their views about the nature and purpose of education were even more strongly opposed than their views about war and peace. Napoleon understood that public education was important for the modernization of France and for the staffing of an imperial government. He created a system of education in France for these purposes. He imposed similar systems on the countries of Europe that he conquered. The basic pattern of European public education has remained for 200 years as Napoleon established it. The basic pattern is centralization, standardization, and rigorous testing by examination. Education was organized rigidly from the top down. The state authorities, beginning with Napoleon himself, decided what was to be taught and when and how. On the whole, the Napoleonic system has done successfully the job for which it was designed. In the countries that adopted it, it produced a population with a high level of literacy and technical competence. It has also acted as a social equalizer, giving talented children from all classes of society an opportunity to become leaders. Napoleon said explicitly that his aim was to open careers to talents. In many ways, the rigidity of the Napoleonic system works to the advantage of an underprivileged child with talent. The child does not have the option of refusing to join the educated elite. Chiara Nappi, a physicist colleague of mine in Princeton, who was educated by the Napoleonic system in Italy and now serves on the Princeton School Board, has argued convincingly that a small dose of Napoleonic rigidity could be helpful to the underprivileged children of America. She knows from her own experience that a little Napoleonic rigidity can be especially helpful to girls with a talent for science. Girls in Italy do not have the option of dropping out of science. Our American system of education gives children of all ages too many opportunities to drop out. We still have something to learn from Napoleon. But we also have something to learn from Tolstoy. Tolstoy devoted 3 years of his life to education. He did not work like Napoleon from the top down. He worked from the bottom up. He organized a school for the children of the peasants on his estate at Yasnaya Polyana. He taught the children himself. He also wrote an extensive account of what he had taught them and what he had learned from them. His purpose was to find out, by personal observation at the individual level, how teaching could and should be done. Before starting his own school, Tolstoy traveled extensively around Europe and observed the Napoleonic system of public education in action. What he saw convinced him that the Napoleonic system was a total failure. Both in Russia and in other European countries, he wrote, "All that the greater part of the people carry away from school is a horror of schooling." He describes the typical child as he saw it in the classroom, a weary, huddled creature with an expression of fatigue, terror, and boredom, repeating with the lips alone the words of others in the language of others, a creature whose soul has hidden in its shell like a snail. He contrasts this dismal scene in the classroom with the same child at home or in the street, full of the joy of life and the love of knowledge, with a smile in its eyes and on its lips, seeking instruction in all things as a joy, expressing its own thoughts clearly and often forcefully in its own language. Unfortunately, Tolstoy had a short attention span. For 3 years, he gave his school and his pupils his passionate attention, and then he abandoned them. A year later, he wrote in a letter to a friend, "The children come to me in the evenings and bring with them memories of the teacher that used to be in me and is there no longer." The children sadly reported to Vasily Morozov, who had been Tolstoy's assistant in the school, "We could not get on with Lev Nikolaevich as we used to." All that is left of the school is the memoir of Vasily Morozov and the descriptions that Tolstoy recorded in his journal. Tolstoy's descriptions are vivid and detailed. He was, after all, born to be a writer rather than a teacher. He describes how he taught creative writing to Syomka and Fyodka, two of his favorite pupils. He begins by trying to force them to analyze the written text of a story by Gogol. The task of analyzing the language leaves the children puzzled and bored. Tolstoy remarks, "You, the teacher, are insisting on one side of understanding, but the pupil has no need at all for what you want to explain to him." Finally, Tolstoy suggests to Fyodka that he write a story himself. Tolstoy gives him a theme: a peasant family with a father who leaves home to become a soldier and then returns after 6 years in the army. Fyodka writes the story, and Tolstoy analyzes the text. The process of textual analysis, which had been so sterile when applied to Gogol, comes alive and acquires meaning when it's applied to Fyodka's own words. Fyodka successfully defends his choice of words against Tolstoy's criticism. In a short time, Fyodka has become not merely a gifted storyteller, but a conscious artist, aware of his own technical mastery. Anyone who wishes to learn more about Tolstoy's educational methods and experiences can find them, together with further references to the literature, in a long article by Michael Armstrong, "Tolstoy on Education, the Pedagogy of Freedom," in the summer 1983 issue of Outlook. Outlook was a quarterly magazine founded by David Hawkins, the philosopher of Los Alamos, and devoted to the education of young children. Unfortunately, like Tolstoy's school and the Enola Gay exhibition, it is now defunct. Its demise does not make its ideas and opinions any the less valuable in the world of today. I wish I had time to read you more about this whole story. I mean, Fyodka's story is an absolute delight. It's a superb story and so beautifully told with such enormous economy of words. But I'm afraid I don't have time for that. But anyway, I highly recommend it. Napoleon and Tolstoy both proclaimed important truths about education. Napoleon proclaimed that the essence of education is discipline. Tolstoy proclaimed that the essence of education is freedom. Those two doctrines seem to be diametrically opposed. How can they both be true? They can both be true because Napoleon and Tolstoy were concerned with different kinds of children and different meanings of the word education. For Napoleon, education meant the training of an intellectual elite who would find careers in the institutions of a technically organized society. For Tolstoy, education meant opening the eyes of ordinary children to the wonders of the world around them. For Napoleon, education meant cramming docile children with specialized knowledge. For Tolstoy, education meant giving all children, docile or not, direct experience of creative activity in art and literature and science. In the modern world, even more than in Tolstoy's world, both kinds of education are necessary. We need to give every child a taste of the Napoleonic discipline that leads to useful skills and brilliant careers. And we need to give every child, especially the child who is turned off by Napoleonic discipline, a taste of the Tolstoyan freedom that leads to the growth of natural scientific curiosity and artistic expression. Only Napoleon can give us a cadre of technically trained experts to make our society economically competitive. And only Tolstoy can give us a population of culturally and scientifically literate citizens who might possess the wisdom to save our society from Napoleonic follies. Our systems of public education can use all the help they can get, both from Napoleon and from Tolstoy. We have a long way to go. So I turn now from education to science. In the practice of scientific research, just as in the practice of education, we see two contrasting styles, the Napoleonic and the Tolstoyan. In the last few years, I had the opportunity of visiting two extraordinary laboratories, both in Switzerland, the International Particle Physics Laboratory known as CERN in Geneva, and the IBM Research Center at Rüschlikon near Zurich. These happen to be the two places where the most spectacular discoveries in the physics of the last 20 years have been made. At CERN in particle physics and at Rüschlikon in condensed matter physics. The people at CERN discovered the beautiful world of W and Z particles. The people at Rüschlikon discovered scanning tunneling microscopes and high-temperature superconductors. These two laboratories are wonderful examples to illustrate the two styles in science. CERN, with its big machines and its centralized administration, belongs firmly to the Napoleonic tradition, even if the new Director General, Christopher Llewellyn-Smith, does not wear the imperial tiara as flamboyantly as his predecessor, Carlo Rubbia. The IBM laboratory at Rüschlikon is just as firmly Tolstoyan, with a social structure resembling an extended family and nobody giving orders. The two styles are clearly appropriate to the different tasks that the two laboratories are engaged in. To operate successfully a machine of the size and complexity of LEP, the Large Electron-Positron Collider, Napoleonic centralization is unavoidable. Big machines require big egos to build and operate them. Each experiment at LEP resembles a military campaign with elaborate logistics and timetables prepared several years in advance. On the other hand, military timetables would have been totally out of place at Rüschlikon, where the major discoveries were unexpected and unplanned. At Rüschlikon, the administration provides excellent equipment for talented scientists to play with, and then gives them the freedom to play. In all areas of science, the future will bring opportunities to build new tools and make new discoveries, some requiring Napoleonic organization and discipline, others requiring Tolstoyan chaos and freedom. Both on the national and the international level, the funding for science is likely to be unstable. Money for science will be increasingly spasmodic and unpredictable. In such an environment, Napoleonic enterprises will be poorly adapted, Tolstoyan enterprises will be better adapted to survive. We should be prepared to shift science as far as we can toward the Tolstoyan style of operation. In some sciences, such as microbiology and neurobiology, Tolstoyan chaos already prevails to a large extent. The two areas of science for which a shift away from Napoleonic rigidity will be most difficult are particle physics and space science. So I'll say a few words about each of those in turn. When I began life as a particle physicist 50 years ago, most of the major discoveries were made in Europe by people studying the cosmic rays that bombard the Earth from outer space. Particle physics was then in a Tolstoyan phase. Three young Italians, Conversi, Pancini, and Piccioni, working with homemade particle counters in the chaos of post-war Italy, discovered that the common cosmic ray meson, later called the muon, had only weak interactions with matter. And Cecil Powell, working with microscopes and photographic plates at Bristol in England, discovered the rarer, strongly interacting cosmic ray meson, which he called the pion. So the new wave of particle physics grew in a few short years out of improvised experiments, observing whatever particles nature happened to provide. And meanwhile, the Americans at Berkeley and Cornell and Chicago were preparing to build accelerators that would produce particles in great abundance and put the European cosmic ray experimenters out of business. Within 5 years, the accelerators triumphed, and particle physics entered a long Napoleonic phase. For 40 years, the accelerators grew bigger and more expensive, and the accelerator Napoleons collected their Nobel Prizes for leading successively larger and more expensive teams of scientists to victory. Now, particle physics is struggling to survive the disaster of the superconducting supercollider. When I speak of the disaster of the superconducting supercollider, I don't mean the cancellation of the supercollider project 2 years ago. The disaster occurred 5 years earlier when the promoters of the supercollider led the Congress and the public to believe that we couldn't do particle physics for less than $5 billion. That belief was not only false, but immensely harmful to the future of science. And the harm would have been much greater if the supercollider project had been allowed to continue. Now that the supercollider is dead, we have a chance to recover. The time may be ripe for a new Tolstoyan phase in particle physics. Even the scientists who believed that the superconducting supercollider was a splendid idea were aware that the big particle accelerators were running into a law of diminishing returns. Each step up in the size of accelerators cost more money than earlier steps and took a longer time to produce new discoveries. The ratio of scientific output to financial input was diminishing rapidly as the size increased. At some point, not far in the future, the further growth of accelerators was bound to grind to a halt. And in the meantime, nature continues to provide a free supply of cosmic rays, and there are reasons to believe that nature may also provide a free supply of unknown and exotic particles pervading the universe. Groups of scientists in many countries are building large detectors deep underground with the aim of detecting neutrinos from the sun and incidentally searching for unknown and exotic particles. The underground detectors observe natural events with technically sophisticated methods similar to those used for detecting particles in accelerator experiments. 5 modern underground detectors are now in operation. Many more are being built and planned. The new generation of underground detectors has 4 virtues. First, they're cheaper than accelerators by roughly a factor of 10. Second, they are flexible and can easily be reprogrammed to search for new phenomena in response to new ideas. Third, they're more likely than accelerator experiments to make totally unexpected discoveries. And fourth, they lend themselves better than accelerators to an informal and Tolstoyan style. Accelerators still have virtues that underground detectors lack: high precision of measurement, high abundance of particles, and reproducibility of results. In the future, if we're lucky, radically new techniques of accelerators may allow a radical decrease in size and cost for an accelerator of given energy. Particle physics will continue to need accelerators as well as underground detectors, but the balance in the future is likely to shift toward underground detectors, and this is a hopeful trend for people like me who are incurable Tolstoyans. So I see a bright future for particle physics after the Napoleonic era ends. And next, a few remarks about space science. Here, even more than in particle physics, the Napoleonic style has been dominant for the last 30 years. Missions on a grand scale, such as the Voyager explorations of the outer planets and the Hubble Space Telescope explorations of distant galaxies, have brought back to Earth a wealth of scientific knowledge and also brought back political glory to the bureaucratic Napoleons of NASA. But within NASA, just as in the community of particle physics, winds of change are blowing. Space scientists are keenly aware that times are changing. Billion-dollar missions are no longer in style. Funding in the future will be chancy, and the best chances of flying will go to missions that are small and cheap. I recently spent some weeks at JPL, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California. JPL built and operated the Voyager missions. It is the most independent and the most imaginative part of NASA. I was particularly interested in two planetary missions that the people at JPL hope to fly. One is called Cassini, and the other is called Neptune Orbiter. Cassini is the last of the grand missions belonging to the Napoleonic tradition. The Cassini hardware is standing in a clean room at JPL, waiting for launch in 1997 if all goes well. After a long and complicated journey, Cassini will stay in orbit around Saturn and make close encounters with Saturn's rings and satellites, sending back to Earth far more information than the Voyagers could provide during their brief flyby. Cassini looks like Voyager. It's a massive spacecraft carrying appendages on which a variety of instruments are deployed. The cost of the mission, including 5 years of operation at Saturn, is estimated at $3.5 billion. From a scientific point of view, Cassini is a superb mission. But from a political point of view, it's highly dubious. It's a prime example of the sort of mission that reformers, both in NASA and in Congress, would like to abolish. Neptune Orbiter is not standing in a clean room at JPL. It is only a dream in the minds of a small team of designers. It's not yet an approved proposal, much less an approved mission. The idea of Neptune Orbiter is to do at Neptune, 3 times as far away as Saturn, the same job that Cassini will do at Saturn, but to reduce the cost by a factor of 10 by using radically new technology. 4 new technologies are crucial for the reduction of costs. First, drastic shrinkage of instruments and computers without loss of performance. Shrinkage in weight by a factor of 40 has already been achieved. In fact, I held in my hands the instrument package that should go onto Neptune Orbiter. That already exists. The hardware of the instruments is there. And the whole thing weighs 7 kilograms, compared with the Voyager instruments, which were actually less capable and weighed 200 kilograms. So it's a reduction in weight by something like a factor of 40 for a greatly improved performance. So that shrinkage already has happened. But the second new technology, solar electric propulsion, that means using a xenon ion jet engine powered by solar energy instead of chemical rockets and plutonium energy generators, which the Voyagers carried, for the long haul from Earth to Neptune. Third, atmospheric braking in the thin stratosphere of Neptune to reduce the speed of the spacecraft and achieve an orbit around Neptune without using large quantities of propellant. And fourth, inflatable structures. That means essentially big balloons, which afterwards are hardened chemically but made rigid in space. So these are inflatable structures deployed in space by blowing up big balloons with small quantities of gas at very low pressure. I visited the inflatable structures group at JPL. They have dreams of reducing the costs of all large, thin structures, such as radio antennas, solar collectors, optical mirrors, and air brakes, by a factor of 100. All those new technologies are sprouting at JPL in a Tolstoyan fashion, driven by enthusiasm from the bottom rather than by management from the top. Neptune Orbiter is a daring venture breaking new ground in many directions. If Neptune orbiter fails to fly, some other, even more daring mission will succeed. In space science, just as in particle physics, the collapse of the old Napoleonic order will open new opportunities for adventurous spirits. So after these digressions into education and science, I come finally to ethics. Back again to the ethical dilemma faced by Truman and Stimson in 1945. Was their decision to use the bombs to attack civilian populations right or wrong? There can be no final answer to that question. Looking at the results of the decision at the time it was made, the soldiers then fighting in the Pacific War and expecting soon to be landing on the beaches of Kyushu had no doubt that the decision was right. Nothing that happened since is likely to change those soldiers' minds. They believe the bombs saved their lives. I myself was not about to be landing on the beaches of Kyushu, but I was expecting, in August 1945, to fly to Okinawa with a large force of Royal Air Force bombers to assist in the strategic bombing of Japan. We intended, with this force based in Okinawa, to kill for each month as long as the war lasted, as many Japanese as died at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So at the time, I felt, as the soldiers felt, that Truman's decision was right. The nuclear bombing was brutal and bloody, but no more brutal and bloody than the non-nuclear bombing that Bomber Command had been doing in Germany and was intending to do in Japan. In a single attack on Dresden 6 months earlier, our Bomber Command had killed more people than the nuclear bomb would kill in Hiroshima. So if Truman could bring the whole bloody business to an end with 2 more bombs, then so far as I was concerned, he was clearly justified in using them. When I look back now at Truman's decision, with 50 years of hindsight, I still see him doing the right thing insofar as it was in his power to do the right thing. But I see him now as Tolstoy saw Napoleon, not as a supreme warlord commanding his forces to move as he pleased, but as a child pulling the strings in a carriage while the carriage rolls along through the night. Truman, like Napoleon, was swept along by forces beyond his control. But Truman was more Kutuzov than Napoleon. Truman understood his own limitations and the immensity of the problems that he faced. He understood that the deployment of the forces in the Pacific War, including the 509th Composite Group that was deployed on the island of Tinian for the purpose of delivering nuclear weapons onto Japanese targets, was a huge and complex machine programmed to roll inexorably forward to the goal of enforcing a Japanese surrender. He was enveloped in the fog of war, ignorant of the balance of forces inside the Japanese government, and receiving no clear message from the nuclear experts who were supposed to advise him about the use of the bombs. He had, and he could have had, no compelling reason to halt that machine. And having no compelling reason, he had, in fact, no power to stop it. The machine rolled on, and Truman, in his carriage, rolled on behind it. 1945 was far too late for Truman or anyone else to reverse decisions that had been made several years earlier, in 1941 or in 1939. There would have been a chance in 1941 to set history moving along a different path. That was the year when the big decisions were made to rush full speed into the creation of a nuclear industry in the United States, to develop and build nuclear weapons as fast as possible, to set up the Los Alamos laboratory to design them, and to set up a special military organization to deliver them. The scientists who pushed the development of the bombs in 1941 bear the largest share of responsibility for the dropping of the bombs in Japan in 1945. The blame, if there is to be blame, belongs to the physicists. We know why the physicists in 1941 felt compelled to develop weapons. They were afraid of Hitler. They knew that nuclear fission had been discovered in Germany in 1938 and that the German government had started a secret uranium project soon thereafter. They had reason to believe that Heisenberg and other first-rate German scientists were involved in the secret project. They had great respect for Heisenberg and equally great distrust. They were desperately afraid that the Germans, having started their project 3 years sooner than the United States, would succeed in building nuclear weapons first. This fear was so real that hardly a single physicist who was aware of the possibility of nuclear weapons could resist it. This fear allowed scientists to design bombs with a clear conscience. It would have been impossible for the community of American physicists to say to the world in 1941, "Let Hitler have his nuclear bombs and do his worst with them. We refuse on ethical grounds to have anything to do with such weapons. It will be better for us in the long run to defeat him without using such weapons, even if it takes a little longer and costs us more lives." Hardly anybody in 1941 would have wished to make such a statement. And even if some of the scientists had wished to make it, the statement could not have been made publicly, because all discussion of nuclear matters was hidden behind walls of secrecy. The world in 1941 was already divided into armed camps, with no possibility of communication between them. Scientists in Britain and America, scientists in Germany, and scientists in the Soviet Union were living in separate black boxes. It was too late in 1941 for the scientists of the world to take a united ethical stand against nuclear weapons. The latest time that such a stand could have been taken was in 1939, when the world was still at peace and secrecy not yet imposed. In 1939, a great opportunity was missed. Niels Bohr, the great Danish physicist, arrived in America in January 1939, bringing from Europe the news of the discovery of fission. Within a few months, Bohr and Wheeler had worked out the theory of fission in America. The possibility of a fission chain reaction had been experimentally confirmed in several countries, and Zeldovich and Khariton had worked out the theory of chain reactions in Russia. All this work was openly discussed and very rapidly published. So the summer of 1939 was the moment for decisive action to forestall the building of nuclear weapons. Nothing was then officially secret. The leading actors in all countries, Bohr and Einstein and Fermi and Heisenberg and Kapitsa and Zeldovich and Joliot and Piles and Oppenheimer, all were still free to talk to one another and to decide upon a common course of action. The initiative for such a common course of action would have most naturally come from Bohr and Einstein. They were the two giants who had the moral authority to speak for the conscience of mankind. Both of them were international figures who stood above narrow national loyalties. Both of them were not only great scientists, but also political activists, frequently engaged with political and social problems. Why did they not act? Why did they not at least try to achieve a consensus of physicists against nuclear weapons before it was too late? Was their distrust of Heisenberg already in 1939 too strong to be overcome? I do not know the answer to those questions. All I know is that 1939 was the last chance for physicists to establish an ethical tradition against nuclear weapons, similar to the Hippocratic tradition that stopped the leading biologists from promoting biological weapons. That chance was missed, and from that point on, the march of history led inexorably to Hiroshima. That chance that was missed in 1939 was a chance to create an ethic of nonviolence in the newborn world of nuclear engineering. After that came 50 years of history, still dominated by wars and other kinds of violence. But I've only a few minutes left, and I now turn from the past to the future. What can we do now to ensure that nuclear weapons will not be used in the years to come? What can we do to strengthen the ethic of nonviolence that we failed to establish 55 years ago? Tolstoy gave us a clear answer to those questions. Some years after he finished War and Peace, he began to think deeply about ethical questions, and he underwent a religious conversion. He believed that he had the key to the problems of war and peace. He became the prophet of a new religion, to the great annoyance of his wife and friends. His wife liked him better when he was writing novels than when he was preaching. But he went on preaching for the rest of his life, preaching the ethic of nonviolence. His answer to the problems of war and peace was a total commitment to nonviolence. He preached uncompromising opposition to all weapons, to all military organization, to all coercive action of governments. For Tolstoy, nuclear weapons would have raised no ethical dilemma. He would have regarded nuclear weapons as an ultimate absurdity, demonstrating the folly of military force in a particularly dramatic way. The great blossoming of nonviolence as a mass political movement was the work of Gandhi, first in South Africa and then in India. Gandhi was a disciple of Tolstoy and corresponded with Tolstoy while he was fighting for the rights of the Indian minority in South Africa. After he returned to India to organize the campaign for Indian independence, Gandhi held his followers for 30 years to a Tolstoyan code of behavior. He proved that satyagraha, soul force, can be an effective substitute for bombs and bullets in the liberation of a people. Satyagraha was an effective weapon in Gandhi's hands because he was, unlike Tolstoy, an astute politician. Gandhi's magic failed at the end of his life when the campaign against British rule was won and he was trying to bring India to independence as a united country. He had then to deal with quarrels between Hindu and Muslim, deeper and more bitter than the quarrel between British and Indian. 5 months after the violent birth of independent India and Pakistan, Gandhi was shot by a Hindu nationalist who considered him insufficiently patriotic. The subsequent history of India proved that the ethic of nonviolence was not strong enough to survive the death of its leader and to withstand the temptations of power. A flowering of nonviolence on a smaller scale occurred in the civil rights movement in the United States, with Martin Luther King as the leader. Like Gandhi in India, King used Tolstoyan tactics effectively to fight for the rights of his people. King was assassinated, like Gandhi, with his fight unfinished. But while Gandhi led his people for 30 years, King only had 10. And after King's death, the United States reverted further and further into a culture of violence. Never was there a time in the history of the United States when the Tolstoyan ethic of nonviolence was more impotent, when violent crime was more prevalent, and guns more popular than they are today. Nevertheless, history is full of surprises, and it's possible that the history of the 21st century has a big surprise in store for us. It is possible that the monstrous excesses of violence to be seen today all over the world, the senseless murders in the streets of America, the massacres in Bosnia and in Rwanda, the 100 million uncleared landmines killing children daily in Asia, the absurd accumulations of nuclear weapons that we cannot use and are unable to destroy. All these things are parts of a pattern that will lead to a radical change in human perceptions. Perhaps it will happen, as the biologist Haldane wrote in 1923. The tendency of applied science is to magnify injustices until they become too intolerable to be borne, and then the average man whom all the prophets and poets could not move, turns at last and extinguishes the evil at its source. Perhaps the 21st century will see a conscious turning of mankind toward the ethic of nonviolence as the only way we can survive. Nonviolence as Tolstoy preached it, nonviolence as Gandhi and King practiced it, nonviolence at all levels, domestic, national, international. A radical turning away from violence in the 21st century, like the radical turning away from slavery in the 19th. The turning away from violence will not happen in a year or in a decade, but it might happen in a century. That is my hope and my dream. Thank you. Well, we have... Oh, I don't forget the document. Anyhow, the point is we have now still 3/4 of an hour still ahead of us. It's going to be a long session. And I would suggest those people who leave should leave. The rest of us can stay. Anyway, I hope some of us at least will stay it out. And now I can more or less see your faces. I better stay by the mic. There are 3 microphones, one on each side in the lower part of the auditorium and one up in the balcony. So I hope that people who ask questions will go to the mics. Okay. And otherwise, I'll repeat the questions.
You said earlier that building great machines requires great ego, and it reminded me of something I believe you wrote about called a Dyson sphere, where people would take apart their solar system and literally build a sphere around their sun so they'd have more surface area. And then it occurred to me that perhaps to do something like that, you'd need to raid another solar system that might be inhabited and might not be so happy about that. Might be. Hard to tell. My question then leads me to the future and your hope about it. It seems that we've gotten in ourselves in quite a mess with a lot of our big technological structures, particularly the nuclear one. Without even using the bombs, we've created a mess up the river here at Hanford. Do you think we can build the massive structures it's going to take to clean things up, both social structures that are nonviolent and physical structures that are nonviolent? Or do you think that can be done in a matter of peace or a matter of war?
Well, that's a long question, and in fact, it's several questions. But I'll leave aside the Dyson spheres. That's, of course, a totally different subject. That's concerned with not with what we might do, but what other people in space, other creatures in space might have already done. And so I'll leave that aside for the time being. But as far as the future of technology goes, I'm, of course, always hopeful. I'm a congenital optimist, and I think it comes very much just from having survived World War II. Everybody who grew up in the 1930s has to be thankful that he is or she is still alive. I mean, the 1930s were so much worse than anything we have to deal with today. Things then really looked black, and we had economic depression. We had England was much, ecologically speaking, in much more of a mess in the 1930s than it is now. The water was much filthier, the air was much filthier. England's amazingly clean now compared with what it was then. And so in all respects, the difficulties we have to face today are nothing compared with what we had in the 30s. So I must say, I mean, to me, things on the whole are going astonishingly well compared with what it might have been. But I mean, there are certainly real problems, of which probably the greatest is just the population problem, the fact that technology has given us the power to reduce death rates all over the world, and that the birth rates are still high, and that This is creating tremendous environmental squeeze, and that's essentially the main problem, compared with which I think Hanford is trivial. Hanford is just a local problem, which I don't consider all that serious. I mean, it's a political problem and a source of endless debate, and especially it's a source of livelihood for lawyers, but I don't regard Hanford as all that serious. I mean, we could just let it sit there for 1,000 years. It isn't really hurting people much, and it's nothing compared with the human problems caused by overpopulation and lousy health systems and lousy economic systems in many parts of the world. And the question is, can we deal with the population problem without draconian measures? I think we can. I think we've seen it happen in many countries, and there's no reason why we shouldn't see it happen all over the world. But technology certainly can help. It's not mainly a technical problem, but the technology of birth control certainly can be improved, and it can be made more widely accessible, it can be made more invisible, it can be made less subject to government regulation, and that will be all to the good. So to my mind, the direction in which technology is going is on the whole Tolstoyan. I mean, the birth control being a good example, that it's becoming more flexible and more freely available than it used to be. And generally speaking, the new technologies tend to be less Napoleonic than the old ones. And in many ways, Napoleonic technologies are dinosaurs which are shortly to become extinct. And the new technologies are birds and mammals, which can be a little bit more nimble. And so I'm of course, as you see, an incurable optimist. Yes.
Thank you for coming to Portland, Professor Dyson. I'm sure we're all awestruck by your profound message. The interesting questions and comments that I wanted to bring up first was the Axion research in particles, and then also the interesting event of the Tokyo fire and earthquake at the end of the war, that perhaps the Japanese thought that that was some kind of spiritual message from God or something. I mean, of course we would think that today, but it was coincidental about the great earthquake in Tokyo at the end of the war, and the vast destruction and fire that it caused. I don't recall the exact date of the Tokyo earthquake, but I thought that was an interesting event to happen right at the end of the war.
Yeah, I know nothing about either of those subjects, and I mean, I'm surprised about this earthquake. I didn't know it ever happened. I mean, the big Tokyo earthquake was in the 1920s when the city was largely destroyed and burned. But I didn't know there was another one in 45. So, up there?
And Dr. Dyson, you mentioned that 1939 was our last opportunity for scientists as a worldwide group to adopt this philosophy of nonviolence. I've heard it said that genetic engineering potentially would pale nuclear weapons as far as destructive. In your opinion, first of all, does genetic engineering have that potential, and have we already passed the threshold as a world community to adopt a nonviolent philosophy for genetic engineering?
Well, genetic engineering, I would say, is a remarkable demonstration of wisdom. I mean, first of all, of course, the fact is that the biologists did not push biological weapons as they well could have, either in World War II or subsequently, that it was a sort of benign neglect. The biologists didn't get together and declare that they weren't going to do biological weapons, but they just didn't do it. And so the biological weapons programs in this country and in many other countries were run by soldiers with a little bit of help from biologists, but with no great push. And that was a tremendous contrast between the behavior of the biologists and the behavior of the physicists, which I think the biologists deserve enormous credit for. because we imagined in the 1930s that World War II would be a biological war. That was, I mean, the public expectation was biological weapons would be the weapons of choice for World War II. We expected Europe to be destroyed essentially with plagues rather than with bombs. And this did not happen, and I believe it could very well have happened. Biological weapons could be extraordinarily devastating. They still could be, and we're very lucky that the community of biologists has just never put any great push behind this, and that's a state of affairs which I hope will continue, and it's certainly been strengthened by recently negotiated treaties and by the unilateral actions of governments. President Nixon ought to get credit. I believe that he is responsible more than any single person for the fact that the world is essentially free of biological weapons today. He unilaterally destroyed all the biological weapons in the United States and declared the policy that we would neither possess nor stockpile or nor produce biological weapons, which we have not done ever since. And then after that, the Russians followed suit, and we've now, of course, negotiated international agreements to keep that as a legal framework for suppressing biological weapons. There are, of course, countries like Iraq which occasionally play around with biological weapons. That will continue. There will always be the dangers of biological weapons, but having a firmly established international regime in which at least the great majority of countries and the United Nations are officially against biological weapons, I think is a tremendous step forward. And I think the biologists have handled this whole affair with great wisdom. And of course, the genetic engineering has been handled in the same, on the whole, in the same spirit. The biologists, when recombinant DNA first appeared, called a moratorium on all experiments for about a year while they assembled an international meeting to decide upon what experiments should be permitted and what experiments should be forbidden. And I think that was this was now what it was 15 years ago or so. The meeting was held at Asilomar in California, and all the biologists of the world came together, and they agreed then on a pretty stringent set of guidelines saying some experiments are permitted and others are not. And since then, those guidelines have been pretty well maintained. I mean, they've been changed from time to time as knowledge improved, but the world has held pretty firmly to these guidelines. And I think that's a wonderful model. That's what the physicists should have done in 1939.
I wanted to return for a minute to the question of our war on the environment right now. I think you're right that population is the biggest problem, and that technology can serve to help a great deal. But I still see a bad attitude among at least a lot of people in the world, a lot of arrogance about how we can control the environment. And I'm wondering if you have any ideas on how best to educate people about, for example, the problems of global warming, which I sense more consensus about, or other things that we can do to more quickly avoid some of the terrible problems that I think growing population can cause.
Yeah, well, there are several questions there. I mean, I'd like to just express sort of my feelings on the whole environmental problem in general, which I think is important. That I grew up in England, and the ecology in England, of course, is very, very different from the ecology of the United States. That there is essentially no wilderness in England at all. Everything in England is essentially artificial. It's a man-made ecology almost totally. The landscape is in many ways much more beautiful and much more diverse than it would have been if everything had been left wilderness. I mean, you know, in England, before human beings messed around with the English landscape, it was essentially uniform forest, or pretty much so. And it may have been beautiful, but I think it's much more beautiful today. I like farmland. I like a variety of fields and hedges and ditches and forests and all the other things you see in the English countryside. So I have a different point of view. In America, you have this sort of taking for granted that wilderness is beautiful and anything man-made is ugly. And I don't agree with that. I think we can, in fact, create a beautiful environment even without preserving necessarily all the wilderness. So, and I think that's something that Europeans understand much better than Americans. However, that being said, of course, even to create a beautiful environment is not easy, and even to preserve it is not easy. It's a constant battle. And it's, of course, made more and more difficult as populations grow larger. And all I can say is that the countries that are densely populated are not the ones where you feel the most crowded. It's sort of strange that although England has an enormously more dense population than this country, but in some ways I feel much more crowded here than I do there. And it's somehow, so it's the distribution which is different, that people in England somehow are living more gently in the landscape than we do here.
I guess it's my turn. To be Napoleonic, you need to have a hierarchy that you can be the lord of, I guess. And it seems in these days that maybe hierarchy is in ascendancy. Maybe it's becoming more common, more prevalent, more powerful, more pervasive. Is that something that you see as a problem? Do you think there's something that needs to be done, specifically to change this sort of, way of organizing large things? Or is the enthusiasm from the bottom going to be enough? I don't want to say that, all Napoleonic trends are bad, obviously, but do we need specific actions to counter, Napoleonic trends, or how do you see that? Thank you.
Oh, I on the whole, I agree with you. I mean, I think the big organizations, of course, always try to preserve themselves, but they always carry the seeds of their own disintegration. And so there's a constant process of renewal, and it's a question of balance. I mean, we need big organizations, certainly for all kinds of purposes. The government has to exist, and it has to be hierarchical to some extent. But it's a question of balance. But what I find, on the whole, very hopeful is the degree to which the big organizations are disintegrating. And you see that everywhere around us, that of course one of the prime examples was AT&T, which got broken up 10 years ago and flourished very much more ever since. And just yesterday it was announced that it's breaking up a little bit more. And there is a tremendous growth of small enterprises, which computer technology, of course, is helping with. My daughter happens to be the president or chairman or whatever it is of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is, I put in a commercial for her because I think she's doing a great job. And so the Electronic Frontier Foundation is, in fact, fighting the battle of freedom for the Internet. It's fighting government censorship on the Internet, and it's trying to preserve the Internet as a bottom-up kind of a system rather than a top-down system. And I think they're doing a good job. And I think, the Internet, of course, is a two-edged sword. It is, to some extent, hierarchical, but it's also very much chaotic. And so this, it's a battlefield where a lot of the future is going to be decided. And I feel myself that, it's a very good illustration of the way modern civilization works, that you have this wonderfully powerful technology which has led to the development of the Internet. We're all enjoying it. We're all sending email messages to each other, and it's great stuff. On the other hand, it accentuates the division in society between those who have it and those who don't. And it actually is, it's making the rich richer and the poor poorer. It's making it very much harder for a kid who grows up in a home without computers ever to get into the system. The kids who have computers in the home have built-in advantages. They become technically literate, and then they get jobs in the high-tech world. Kids which are in the slums never get a chance. So it makes the problems of poverty worse. And I think that's a very serious question, how to deal with that. And there's no question that the free market is not going to solve that problem. The free market always leads to producing more toys for the rich and less necessities for the poor. And so we've got to have, to some extent, a public sector which is going to take charge and see to it that the information highway, or whatever you like to call it, really reaches into the homes of everybody, and at least into the schools that all our kids go to. And that's not going to be done by the free market alone.
That's a great lead-in for my question. I'd like to return to the themes of technology that you had discussed before, particularly the Tolstoyan influence of emerging telecommunications technologies such as the fax machine and the internet, which basically give everyone at a fairly low investment their own printing press and their own distribution mechanism, when arrayed against the sort of Napoleonic themes of totalitarian governments such as those of China. During the coup attempt in 1991 at the Russian White House, one of the things that the KGB tried to do was to shut down all of the telephone lines going into and out of the country. What they didn't realize was that the week before, U.S. Sprint had turned on a large fiber optic cable, and the KGB couldn't find it, which is the reason why they were able to use fax and the computer networks to get the message out to the world. My question to you is this, that although knowledge is power, it's not clear at all whether that's the kind of power that you can use to fight a battalion of tanks. And I'd like to know what your thoughts are on these sort of Tolstoyan tendencies in emerging telecommunications technologies when compared against Napoleonic authoritarian governments.
Well, I think, in fact, that technology does help tremendously. I mean, of course, one enormous help for the powers of anarchy, which I support, was the Xerox machine. I mean, you know, governments, especially dictatorial governments, thrive on secrecy. And essentially the Xerox machine destroyed secrecy, at least in this country and in many others besides. And I mean, that was an enormous step forward. When any private citizen who could grab hold of a document for 2 seconds could Xerox it, it made it essentially impossible to keep secrets anymore, at least on a large scale. And that, I think, has been a great liberating factor in this country, and to some extent in Russia as well. And I remember about 20 years ago when Macintoshes were first produced, we said jokingly that the way to deal with the Soviet Union was just to rain Macintoshes on Russia down from the sky. That would destroy the Soviet government, and that is essentially what happened. It wasn't only Macintoshes, but this kind of technology does strengthen the individual against the state. There's no question on the average. The state is much less nimble in using it, and that has, of course, its good and bad sides. It makes it easier for organized crime. It makes it harder for the police, and sometimes you prefer the police to win. Anyhow, that's enough about that. I have a number of written questions, which I might have a look at, but trouble is, of course, to find time to read them while I'm listening to you. But so there is, I'll take a more brief one. It says, would our current education systems flourish or decline in the absence of exams or grades? And that's, of course, a loaded question. But I happen to vastly prefer abolition of exams and grades. I mean, to my education, I was tremendously lucky to grow up in World War II when the whole system was so screwed up that we didn't even have exams. Well, England was then very short of ships. The greatest lack we had in World War II was ships. And so there was no importation of paper. We needed all the ships we had just to import food and weapons and other necessities. So we didn't import paper. And since in England all examinations have to be written, if you didn't have paper, you couldn't have exams. So it was a wonderful time to get an education. But I'm not sure whether this would apply to the present-day educational system of the United States. I mean, things are very different here. And of course, there are all sorts of kids. Some kids really need a good deal of structure in their lives. And so it could be that grades and exams are not altogether an unmitigated evil. And I would say let's have variety. Let's have some schools with grades and exams and some schools without, and let the kids choose. And that's probably the best you can do. Let's have then a question from the floor. Yes.
One of the remarks that was made on the death of, or at the death of Richard Feynman was that we're running out of a century stock of men of stature like Einstein and Bohr, and that science increasingly is going to be done Napoleonic fashion by committees. In your first work, Disturbing the Universe, you describe, as I recall, thanks to your familiarity with the work of Schwinger and then your friendship with Feynman, you were able to amalgamate their two lines of thought and come up with your own contribution. Would you say that this was an early example of science by committee, or was it just a fortuitous coincidence?
Yeah, well, my career, of course, was mostly luck, and just happening to arrive at Cornell just when Feynman was doing his great stuff. And so I was watching him create the ideas that have now become the prevailing language of particle physics. And so I was just immensely lucky to be there at the right place at the right time. But to go back to the question of the great, whether or not the new generation is producing people equally great as compared with Einstein and Bohr, I don't think you can possibly tell. I mean, I know a lot of marvelous young people, but you can't really spot winners until later. I mean, of course, Einstein was clearly a very great man, even as a young man, and so was Bohr. But they didn't stand out above the whole community when they were young in the way that they do now, 100 years later. And so if I look around me, I see several young people who may or may not end up being great figures of that magnitude. I don't think we've run out of that kind of people, but it's quite likely that they're not doing physics. I think the young people today, very wisely, tend to be doing other things rather than physics. Physics has a reputation of being Napoleonic, and you have these horrible examples of papers that are published in the physics journals with 250 authors. And that doesn't look very good for a young kid who's wanting to discover something important. And so, I mean, actually, of course, there's a lot of small physics going on, but still the tendency is my own children, I think very wisely, decided all to do other things, not physics, with my encouragement. And so I would hope that the great minds of the next generation are probably doing things like biology or neurology or the other things which are not even science at all. And we shall find out then in 50 years who they are.
Professor Dyson, over here on your right.
Good.
Thank you.
you are a noted physicist, mathematician, writer, quixotic visionary. You're also, as I understand it, an educator. And I'd like to bring you back, if I might, to the question of education. I think all of us see with great dismay the seemingly inexorable slow decay of our system of public instruction in this country, and our increasing failure to equip our children with the tools either to succeed in the Napoleonic institutions or to engage in the great game of Tolstoyan adventure. And I wonder what thoughts you have, specifically, if I might press you to that, to look at the question of public instruction in terms of the paradigm you have presented tonight, and what future you see and what changes we might actually succeed in making.
Yes, this is a subject, of course, I don't pretend to be an expert. My own kids all went through the Princeton public schools, and it worked pretty well. What the kids discovered, which was actually the key to the whole situation, is that if you take an American public school, there's one person in the whole system who actually has the power to break the rules, and that's the school psychologist. And so if a kid actually is finding the system intolerable, that all the kid has to do is to go to the psychologist and convince the psychologist that the kid is suffering psychological damage. And then the psychologist then is able to say something has to be done about this, and the principal will agree to do it. And so they've always been able to get around the system that way. And
well, are you suggesting that we might use recombinant DNA to provide us with enough educational psychologists?
So the schools already have psychologists, and at least they do in Princeton. And that's so it's a very useful discovery that my kids made. And but to go to the more serious questions, I feel that the system of this public education is essentially the same kind of a problem as the lousy health service we have in this country. That there's a general distrust of the public sector and a general belief that anything that's done by the public sector is done badly, so the civil servants are not respected. And I think of the contrast between England and America in this respect. My sister, who is a retired social worker, was doing the kind of job that social workers in America hardly are able to do, because their status isn't high enough in the society. In England, my sister, as a social worker, for example, she traveled around visiting unwed mothers. That was her main job. But she had enormous authority to deal with the real problems of her patients. I used to love to go around with her on her tours, and I would play with the baby while she talked with the mother. And the whole thing was a very personal thing, and there was not a great deal of bureaucracy. The main point being that the social worker was a very skilled and highly respected civil servant, and she was well paid, and she had a standard of living much higher than a social worker in America, where they are essentially, they are part of a much more rigid machine. One of the other things that my sister had was a bottle of heroin in the closet, which she was free to dispense to people who were suffering from cancer and other such diseases. And that, of course, would be totally impossible in this country. You'd have lawyers immediately involved. But they trusted her, and so she was able to keep the stuff in the closet and use it when it was necessary. And so the difference between the two countries is just that in England it's sort of taken for granted that if the government does something, the government will do it competently, whereas if business tries to do it, it will be done badly. And whereas in this country, the opposite holds true. And I think that's the primary reason, not that England doesn't have problems, and of course English educational system also has problems, but they're not as acute as they are here. And I think that's the sort of the basic reason. How can we reestablish in this country a tradition of public service in which it's taken for granted that public servants will be highly respected and honest and will do the jobs they're appointed to do. I don't know how to do that, but I think that's the basic problem. It's not really education, but it's the whole social structure which has led to this decline of the status of teachers and the status of schools and the status of all people who run the railroads and everything else.
Professor, would you permit me to give you a piece of advice? I was going to say, have a care for your microphone cord.
Yes. So I'd better stay here. I was trying to see you better, but I said probably safer to stay here.
Dr. Dyson, I'd like to follow up here on your left
Yes.
with a question about education also. I teach middle school, 7th grade, and I like a bit of discipline and I like a lot of play in my classroom, but I see there's another piece, and that is a philosophy of science. And I wonder if you could suggest for me and perhaps others some resources where I could go for some rich words in that area.
Well, I'm the wrong person to ask because I'm very unphilosophical. I mean, I always regard science as much closer to art than to philosophy. That's the way I always do it, and that's the way I see it. That science is essentially done with tools rather like architecture or sculpture. You're building structures or carving structures using the tools of nature or the tools of your intellect. But it's essentially, to my mind, has very little in common with philosophy. On the other hand, of course, there are lots of books about philosophy of science which I don't read. So I'm afraid I can't help you with that. But I should say, I mean, I said harsh things about the American schools, but of course I'm well aware that there are a wonderful, huge number of very dedicated teachers who are great people, and of course I know a lot of them personally. So what I say about the schools doesn't imply that I don't respect the teachers. Yes.
Dr. Dyson, when I think of raising consciousness to nonviolent behavior, I think of that as sort of a heroic thing to do. And when I think of that, the idea, the terms social and economic justice come to my mind. And I was wondering if you could share your ideas on what the relationship between sort of heroic nonviolence and social and economic justice are.
I hope everybody heard that. I guess it's loud enough. I don't know whether these things are so strongly connected, but I mean, there's another example of nonviolence which I wrote about in one of my books, and it is the village of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon in France, which resisted Hitler nonviolently and won. I mean, you know, it was a heroic story. It was a book called Lest Innocent Blood Be Shed by Richard Halley, who recently died, about the story of this village. And I think it was a very remarkable and magnificent story of this village, which in fact defied Hitler using nonviolent methods. And what they did was to save the lives of about 5,000 Jews, which was against the laws of France and against, of course, against the laws of the occupying power. And the Germans knew what was going on, but somehow or other they did kill a number of the leading people in the village in order to put a stop to this nonsense. But the villagers continued. They did not let themselves be intimidated. And so the campaign continued, and the Jews were saved. And in the end, the village survived, except just for a few of the leaders. I think that's a good model for how nonviolence actually can be done. What it required was an enormous degree of discipline and cohesion in the society. I don't think it had much to do with social justice, really, but it meant that the people had to trust each other, they had to rely on each other, and they had all to believe that they were working for a cause larger than themselves. So it had to, in some sense, it relied on social justice in the sense that you had to believe that you belonged to a society that would really hang together. And a society without social justice couldn't have done it. But so the connection is somewhat indirect. And in the case of India, I mean, you couldn't say that in the time of Gandhi that India actually had social justice. But on the other hand, that was one of the things he was fighting for. And he was, in fact, I mean, one of the great planks in his campaign was destruction of the caste system in India, which still hasn't been achieved. I think the world needs economic justice and social justice quite desperately, but I'm not sure that that's enough in order to produce a turn to nonviolence. I think, I mean, these are things that have to be done, all three of them, but they require quite separate efforts. So who's next?
Over here.
Good.
On your right. When you were a child, what was school like? When you were a child, what was school like?
What was what like?
Your school.
Oh, the school. Oh, well, I grew up in England and in the English private school system. I never went, of course, in England, public schools mean private schools, so it's all rather confusing. But anyway, I went to old-fashioned schools where we were taught a lot of Latin and Greek, and still being beaten around with the headmaster was a sadist, and he actually applied the whip quite liberally. So it wasn't as bad as Dickens, but it was a little bit like that, and we survived. And I think one of the good things was that we didn't learn any science officially. There was the school was teaching us geography and history and English and Latin and Greek, a little bit of French, quite a lot of mathematics, but essentially no science. So what we did, the kids actually organized a science society of their own as a rebellion against the school. And that's probably the best thing that we could have done, just in order to learn science ourselves, not have it forced down our throats.
Thanks.
Dr. Dyson, in the center. Do you believe that a proper balance of the benefits of Napoleonic and Tolstoyan attitudes requires an individual duality of mind, a switching between the two, or a balance of individuals within a population?
Well, all three of the above, I suppose. I mean, clearly, it does require a balance in the population, because some people work well in a structured environment and others work very badly, and vice versa. I mean, so you need a structured environment for some and an unstructured environment for others, both in the world of work and in the world of education. So that's certainly true. And to what extent individuals can combine the two, of course, varies. Some of us can and some of us can't. I'm absolutely hopeless on committees. I either lose my temper or else go to sleep. And so I just cannot operate in a hierarchy that works by committees. But some of my friends can, and some of my friends can actually do quite well on committees, like Chiara Nappi, for example, who is a great lady, and also has a spirit of her own. Yes. So, how are we doing for time? Yes, I guess this is the end. So, okay, I'll talk about the Astro Chicken if you like. That was a written question. It just says, where can I find out more about Dr. Dyson's Astro Chicken? Well, I think that's a good note to end on. I mean, the Astro Chicken is just a word which I happen to like, sort of because it's not taken, it's obviously a joke. It's not supposed to be taken seriously. On the other hand, it stands for something serious. What it stands for is life going out into the universe, and that's to me a sort of a grand dream. It's, I think, something that will happen even without our help. Life stayed in the oceans for a couple of billion years, and then finally it found a way to move onto dry land, which involved, of course, a lot of evolution, a lot of redesign of the organism. It had to learn to breathe air instead of water, and it had to learn to live with a dry skin instead of a wet skin. And so there were all kinds of difficulties which had to be overcome, but it finally happened, and then life diversified on land and produced this beautiful planet that we have. And so when I look out at the universe today, and I see all this real estate, which is dull and dead, and I feel sad that there's only one little planet that's alive, and the whole of the rest of the universe seems to be dead. And I think that that's a state of affairs that shouldn't be allowed to continue. And so I hope that life will get loose in the universe, that it will make this third jump from living in air to living in space. And it does require, of course, either natural evolution, which will take maybe a couple of billion years if we didn't exist. But with our help, it could happen very much faster. We could genetically engineer all kinds of life forms, plants and animals, vegetables, bacteria, and possibly humans, to live in space. And that is the way to go. So we shall have a wonderfully diverse future for all kinds of forms of life, living in the most diverse environments on planets and on asteroids and on comets and living in free space. And that this will be a much more beautiful and much more interesting universe than the one we now have. And so that's my dream. And the question is then just what you have to do to achieve that. And the Astro Chicken is sort of a case in point. It's supposed to be a sort of the kind of creature that could live in space. And it's a combination vegetable and animal. It has big green wings, which are exposed to sunlight. So it's like a plant that it absorbs energy from sunlight in order to do its chemistry. But it also needs food. So, I mean, it has to, like a plant, it has to absorb food from some kind of soil. So it has to land on some celestial body like an asteroid and eat whatever it finds there, particularly ice. And it'll be a water-based creature, so it has to have a supply of water of some kind. Fortunately, ice is extremely abundant in the solar system, especially when you move further away from the sun. So it will have no lack of the essential chemicals. And then it will have, of course, a communication system. It'll probably communicate with its friends and relatives by radio, since sound doesn't work in space. And so it will have a radio transmitter and receiver, and it'll have long spindly legs for landing on an asteroid. And it'll have a little brain like a chicken, so it's not too smart, and it will it'll lay eggs and raise a family. So it'll do all these things, and I really believe this is something that will happen in a couple of 100 years if we want it to. I mean, it's something that technology will allow. So it's a question whether we want to do that or not. And I hope that some of us at least will go ahead and do it. And the beauty of it is, of course, it's like solar energy. It's something that you can do on a small scale. It doesn't have to be a huge government project. And I think it will thrive, in fact, on small ventures. And all kinds of creatures will be designed and will be let loose in space. And some of them will survive and some won't. And then the natural process of evolution will take over. So after we've performed our service as midwives, bringing all this to birth, then natural evolution will continue, whether we want to or not, we won't any longer be in control. So thank you. I guess that's